So flagging the therapy was all about investigating the interactions between the world of neuroplasticity and the varying forms of therapy which we use in anxiety and depression. I've always been fascinated by the world of neuroplasticity. So what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the capacity of our brain to change its connections, to increase or decrease its connections, which in turn changes particular pathways in the brain. So what's an unbelievable thought is that all the time during the day, your pathways and connections to the brain are constantly changing. And they're changing from the time you're born to the time you die. So I was fascinated with the concept, well, if this was the case and we looked at mental health conditions, say like all forms of anxiety and depression, well, these too had to be interfacing with these neuroplastic changes. And in fact, we now know from modern research that this is the case. So my next area of interest in doing flagging the therapy was I wanted to see, well, if we started with the basis that there was a solid neuroscientific underpinning as to how all therapies should work, we should be able to start assessing them one by one. So that led me to start looking at different forms of therapies. So I started with, say, all the individual talk therapies, like varying types of psychotherapy, like particularly CBT, mindfulness-based CBT, interpersonal therapy, psychoanalysis, etc., and examined how would these impact on these pathways in the brain if they were dysfunctional, as in anxiety and depression. I then had to look at all different forms of drug therapy to see, well, which ones were effective and which ones acted on particular pathways. And then I moved to the whole area, which was very interesting, of complementary and alternative medicine, where there are multiple therapies which are purported to be of assistance in these conditions. And using this kind of fairly solid scientific underpinning of neuroplasticity, I decided then to examine each one of these and pick out, well, which ones, in my opinion, were scientifically sound and which ones were more likely to be working by what we call the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is actually a very powerful effect in the brain, which temporarily changes our connections and pathways in the brain. But unfortunately, these changes are not persistent. Whereas when we use, for example, therapies such as meditation, mindfulness, CBT, we know for a fact that these type of therapies are inclined to induce more long-term persistent changes which last, because the brain doesn't do quick, the brain does slow and steady, because that's how it works. The final part of flagging the therapy was all about then, well, if we took all forms of anxiety and depression and approached them from a neuroplastic point of view, could we show which therapies were really the best ones to use for each individual condition? And this proved to be very interesting because we know, for example, that different forms of therapy for anxiety are much more effective than, for example, if we use the same therapies in depression. So overall, it was a journey to see which alternative and complementary medicines I could recommend and stand over, which forms of talk therapy I was comfortable with, and what forms of drug therapy I felt would be most effective.